Hi everyone, I'm Victoria. I'm one of the environmental conservation ambassadors for TeenMeets, and I'm here today with Dr. Baumann, who's an accredited professional in the field of marine ecology, earning a bachelor's in science at Ohio State University and a PhD at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina. Dr. Baumann has been instrumental in assisting me in my own research on microplastics pollution with his firsthand experience in the study, and I'm grateful to have obtained his advice. I invited Dr. Baumann here today to gain a greater understanding of hands-on research and how aspiring future researchers and scientists may fulfill their own passions later in their lives. Again, we are so happy to have you here, Dr. Baumann. Okay.
Happy to be here.
So I'll start with my first question. What inspired you to enter this field of study?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess the thing that inspired me to get into the field that I'm in, which I guess I consider to be marine science, which is a pretty broad field, is really just I was interested in it from a young age. I grew up in a landlocked state. I grew up in Ohio. We didn't have an ocean. Every time I got to see one, I thought it was like the coolest and most mysterious thing ever. I really wanted to learn more about it. By the time I got to high school, I was really concerned about things like climate change. And I've remained very concerned about that particular issue. So, my interests and what I thought was really important at the time came together. And I ended up being, I researched kind of at the nexus of like ecology and climate change and resilience. So I think that that's how I got here. I took what I wanted to do and what I liked and what I thought was important, and I kind of stuck them together, and here we are.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I remember last time we connected, you were saying that you originally didn't anticipate studying corals and you had in mind a completely separate study in marine science. Did you face challenges in this transition? And do you feel the niche that you've found now is fulfilling to you?
Yeah. Yeah, two-parter. Let's start with the first part. Was it a weird transition or a hard transition, or did I face challenges going from what I thought I was going to do to what I ended up doing? And the answer, honestly, is that I did, but I also didn't at the same time. I spent a whole lot of time saying, well, I really don't know what I want to do when I grow up, but I'm doing something now and I like it, and I'm just going to keep doing it. And I ended up just sticking with, I started doing undergraduate research at Ohio State, and I wanted to work in a marine biology lab, and the only options were anemones and corals. And the coral lab was hiring, so I took a job and I just stuck with it. I kind of fell in love with it. I didn't really know anything about that particular ecosystem until I started studying it, but I was always the kind of person that if I could learn about any ecosystem, I would think it was awesome. So that's sort of what happened with corals. And it just so happened that, of course, corals are sort of the canary in the coal mine for climate change. It was sort of a perfect storm. It was just fortunate that I had opportunities to make it work. Second part of the question is, do I find my job now to be fulfilling in spite of the fact that it wasn't exactly what I thought I wanted to do? To be honest with you, by the time I got to college, I didn't know what graduate school was. I didn't really have a grasp on what that was and what it meant to like become a professor. And I didn't think that was ever going to be me. I didn't know what I was going to be. I just knew what I liked. And I, shortly after going to graduate school, realized that I really like teaching and mentoring, and that being a professor was like probably right for me. And now I'm here in Maine at Bowdoin College at a small school, teaching, really hands-on with a small number of students in groups, and that is so fulfilling. It's like exactly what I want to do. Yeah. So, and I didn't know that until I got here. Like it hasn't been long since I figured out that's what I wanted to do. It took me a long time to get here. So.
Yeah, no, that's really motivating to us teenagers who are in the midst of all of these options open to us. And I know for myself, I'm a little worried going into college, not really knowing what I want to do with environmental studies. So yeah, that's really uplifting to know that there's going to be a lot of opportunities and I'll be able to like have transitions and find my own niche. And also with that, could you explain in a little bit more detail what your current studies are in relations to corals and climatology?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's a couple of things I guess we can talk about. So since I left my PhD and my postdoctoral work at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina and moved to Maine, which is where I'm at now, my focus day to day has shifted more towards teaching and less towards research. But the research that I'm doing now is informed by the research that I've been doing in the past. So over the last decade or so, I've been working pretty heavily on how an individual coral organism and like the physiology within that animal and its associated symbiotic communities responds to stress. So temperature, nutrients, acidification, things like that. And that's really been my focus, is trying to understand the mechanisms by which these corals will bleach or will not bleach or can recover from bleaching, and things like that, and what underpins that resilience. And now I'm doing very similar work on other organisms. So here in the Gulf of Maine, we don't have tropical coral reefs. So we do have eelgrass meadows, seagrass, and we also have an oyster aquaculture industry here. So we're working sort of on how those organisms respond to climate change, both at the population level and at the organismal level. So I'm still really doing some of the same kind of work, asking the same kind of questions. How do organisms interact with one another, and how do they manage the stressors that are being thrown at them more frequently and for longer periods of time due to climate change? So that's sort of where I'm at now. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about research forever, but I think that probably answered your question.
Adding on to that, I think you kind of touched basis on coral bleaching and the environmental stressors that climate change is putting on it. But what are some of the other implications that you've found, and how do you think that this can affect humans in the near future?
Yeah, sure. So when we're thinking about the climate change question with coral reefs, I guess what we've ended up finding, we're starting to try to do a little bit more applied research, like how can we understand how resilience in corals to bleaching and to other disturbances changes across time and space. Can we use that knowledge then to better manage or conserve our coral reefs? And also, is some of this interesting physiological work that we're doing going to be useful for folks who are doing coral restoration? So I guess to answer the question about human implications is the last project that I did in Belize, which is where I did the bulk of my PhD. I worked one-on-one kind of very heavily with a conservation organization down there called Fragments of Hope, which does really awesome coral reef restoration. If you're interested in coral restoration, you've probably heard of them or seen their videos. They kind of make news all the time for being extremely awesome at this. So we partnered with them to try to learn a little bit about how environmental gradients can change coral growth rates in nurseries and kind of make them or not make them more resilient. We were sort of basing this idea off the idea that we have these corals that are living offshore on the barrier reef in Belize. We have these other coral reefs that are not as nice to look at, but still have some corals on them much closer to shore in Belize, where it gets hotter and there's more nutrients and sediment in the water, and all of that is, we think, bad. But some corals are doing okay there, right? So maybe those corals that live in that less ideal environment, maybe they're predisposed in some way, maybe genetically, to say be more resilient to future ocean conditions. And if that's the case, then maybe we want to start using those guys for coral restoration, right? It sounds like a good idea. So we did an experiment to assess whether that was true or not, and didn't go quite as planned, right? So we moved those corals around to the more pristine reef environment where we have the main reef structure in Belize, and they did not do very well. But corals that we moved from that nicer water offshore to this nearshore environment in the short term actually did pretty well. They grew pretty fast. They grew faster there than they did in the nicer environment. So barring a major bleaching event, that seems like a place that you might even have your coral nurseries and use that situationally as a coral nursery environment, that nearshore reef. So that means that you don't have to spend as much money and energy and resources and time on gas and a crew and a boat and all that to get way out 30 kilometers offshore to work on the main reef structure all the time. Instead, you could bring some corals and fragment them out and grow them in your nearshore habitat that's much closer to shore. So that could be some sort of cost-effective mechanism. But again, whether a nearshore site is good or bad for corals is very dependent upon how warm it gets in the summer, any given year, and also just a lot of local scale stressors. So every individual local reef like needs to be investigated for this, or else it's hard to make any kind of blanket statement. So we at least have that relationship now with this restoration organization, and we'd love to keep working with them based on whatever their needs are, right? So my research questions now are to contact my colleagues in Belize and say, I have research questions, but what are your needs? What do you need to improve your ability to do this restoration work, or to solve some scientific problems that you have? And I think there's a kind of two important things about that, is that we as folks from the United States don't necessarily or should not necessarily be going to places like Belize or anywhere else in the world and saying, oh, hey, I'm an expert, do what I say. Instead, we should be saying, how can I help you achieve your goals and make your community more resilient and healthier and better in general, right? So that kind of like anti-colonial spin on how we do this sort of work is, I think, really, really, really important. And second, also, we all want coral reefs to do better. So we have to work together and we have to cross boundaries. So I think that's where I draw my hope. And it's convenient that they're fragments of hope. That's like their whole thing, right? So that's where I'm at on human stuff. And of course, we also should at some point talk about microplastics. But I think I'll stop talking so that you can ask me another question, and maybe we can go that direction.
Yeah, that does bring me to my next question. I remember you discussing how you've looked at microplastics in corals. Can you explain a little bit about what your findings were and some of the what brought you to that area of study?
Yeah, I can. What brought me to that area of study was a complete accident, as with most things in life. I had some friends who were doing some research into microplastics on corals, and an opportunity to jump in on that project kind of came out of nowhere. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I can give you some samples. And I was just going to give them some samples I had already collected and let them kind of do their thing. And then like a week after that, a student walked into my office that wanted a summer position in the lab. And she was an environmental health science major who was really, really interested in that nexus between public health and environmental science. And she said, like, I want to work in a marine biology lab to figure out whether I want to go into graduate school for that, or whether I want to go to medical school and like try to work my way back to environmental stuff. And of course, I said, yeah, great, awesome. What do you want to do? And microplastics were like the first thing she said. And I was like, wow, this is going to work out. I have a project that we could try to do. So this student, Kirsty Oldenburg, who's the lead author on the paper that we're going to be talking about for a couple minutes here, she's now in medical school, but as an undergraduate, she did all of this work. All I did was help direct her. So what we found is we collected corals we collected some coral cores actually to look at growth rates across time for a different project, but we looked inside of the tissue that we collected from those corals. We collected them all along the Belize Mesoamerican Barrier Reef System. And pretty much all of them had microplastics in them. Not really surprising. The tissue all contained microplastics. It wasn't possible for us, based on the methodology that we were using, to decide whether the microplastics were being eaten or whether they were just kind of getting stuck to the coral mucus and kind of put into that matrix. It could be either, it could be both. It probably is both. But it's an emergent field, microplastic research, and we were still learning some of the methodology. In fact, we didn't really have the tools as a lab that wasn't really that interested in chemistry otherwise to really get at exactly what every plastic was. So we ended up saying, like, we can identify really easily what is a microfiber, because they're, probably they're colorful and they're pretty big, and you can like melt them a little bit and you can make sure you can tell what they are. It's pretty easy. And anything that just doesn't look natural in terms of color, that's put there by humans, whether that's, a piece of cotton that's dyed or a piece of wool that's dyed or some other kind of slightly altered, mostly natural product. It still has human derivative in it. So we were interested in sort of understanding how that happened and what the trends were in that. And what we found really is that the microplastic or the microfiber concentration that we saw in our samples across Belize could be pretty heavily correlated with how close you were to a big river or a river that had a huge population upstream. Or you were in some oceanographic area, say like a current that recirculated like this, a place like that, that was at a mouth of a big river was full of plastic relative to everywhere else. And that actually made sense from our anecdotal evidence. When we're diving on these reefs, we can see these like slicks of trash sometimes that are in these sort of recirculating areas. So we looked at the data and we were like, oh, this makes perfect sense. It's sad, right? There's plastics everywhere, but at least now we kind of understand a little bit about how they got there and that they do in fact get into the corals. This was the first study that I'm aware of. I've been looking. I think this is the first study ever to look at the concentration of microplastics on tropical corals collected directly from a reef. Usually people feed corals plastics in a tank and then say, yeah, they can eat those, right? But nobody really goes out and just says like, do you have plastics in you, coral? And like we did that. And that was a thing that was true. So it was pretty cool. It's pretty cool to be like, oh, I think we're the first people to do a thing. And yeah, it was really cool.
That is amazing. And I wish I could be there to help you with that research. Oh, that would be amazing. Adding on to that, what do you think could be the trophic implications? Do you think that the ecosystems around these tropical corals can be negatively impacted by plastics that are inside of the corals, which are habitats and nurseries for hundreds of species of fish and marine life?
Yeah. So that was Kiersey's big question that she wanted to know the answer to as well, as somebody who was really, really interested in that environmental health kind of perspective. Yeah, I don't know. I think we need to know more information, right? Like we have all these studies now that are coming out that are like, there's microplastics at the bottom of the ocean. There's microplastics in every glacier. There's microplastics deep into the skeleton of a coral that's never seen daylight, right? Like they're everywhere. They're in everybody's poop all the time, right? Like they're everywhere. How much do they affect us? And I don't know the answer to that question. And I think it's really highly variable, and that some way smarter people who actually like are good at chemistry will hopefully be able to get those answers, and that they are seeking those answers for sure. But people who are, ecologists like me, like I could count stuff and then show you on a map how many of the thing there was in any given place, but I don't truly understand necessarily exactly what impact that's having. And that's, I think, where we need to go next, right? So I can say from the literature that a study came out a couple of years ago that shows, and this was on macroplastics, if you can see a visible piece of macroplastic touching a coral, and this is in the coral triangle in Indonesia, if you can see a visible piece of plastic touching a coral, that coral is 99% more likely to have a disease than a coral that doesn't have a visible piece of plastic touching it. So that suggests that the idea that a plastic is a disease vector is valid for corals in particular. And I think that that's key and really important to think about, because if plastics bring us disease to our reef, there aren't that many corals left, and new diseases are going to be really, really bad. As you can see in the Caribbean right now, which is getting hit by a new disease called stony coral tissue loss disease of relatively unknown origin, and we don't really know how to stop it. And it's ravaging what's left of our Caribbean coral reefs. It's been very, very bad. We don't really have a lot of corals left for that to happen to. So the implications could be really, really dire, not just for coral reefs, but for all sorts of ecosystems. So I think it's really important that we do understand it. And we also recognize that there's no easy solution to that problem, right? Like going out and skimming the surface and pulling all the trash out of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is not going to keep us from having microplastics in our oceans. It's just not. That's based on the way that they degrade. A massive shift in our economic system is sort of required to pull us off of petroleum and gas and plastics, which are derivative of the same oil-based products, right? So, that's a big one, right? But that's what we're all here for, right? That's like what our generation, my generation, your generation, that's what we're after, right? We're after this big change because our futures literally depend on it. So.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point that there are all of these multi-stress impacts that are being put on our endangered and very fragile ecosystems, and especially with the microplastics pollution, which is becoming even more prevalent right now. And we're just starting to tap the surface of what are the toxicological effects or what are the ecological effects. I think that there definitely needs to be a worldwide status and action towards this problem. And I definitely think that a lot of countries like the Netherlands, and even there was a country in Africa who are conducting their own research on microplastics pollution. I think more of that must be done domestically as well. I know California has already stated that they're going to start, I think this year, studying microplastics in our drinking water. So it's something that I feel like should be more talked about and brought into conversation more so we can manage this, because it is prevalent and it is pervasive worldwide.
Yeah, definitely. And there's folks working across all levels of our government and non-governmental organizations who are trying to tap into other countries and work on waste streams and start thinking about how we can try to keep this stuff from entering our waterways to start with, because that's really the only way that it's not going to be there. If we're pulling stuff out of the water, it's already degraded. We've already got plastics. We've already got microplastics, right? So it has to never enter our waterways, or alternatively, it could never exist. But we can't have a world with no plastics. I think it's really important to point that out, that where we are right now, we can't have a world with no plastics, but plastics could be different and we can have a lot less of them for sure. So yeah, right. There's a lot of work to do all across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, there definitely is. And this is kind of backtracking a little bit, but I was interested in understanding how the pandemic has affected your research, or if it has made it harder to connect globally, since you have studied in Belize. And I'm assuming right now, because of all the lockdowns and stuff like that, it's been a little bit harder to do research internationally. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, COVID has honestly made me rethink my own relationship with plastic. I see more plastic in my life in the last 2 years than I have in the last 10 years. For one, I think that's just sort of an aside. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? And it's really important that we think about when we actually truly need that product and when we don't. But how did COVID affect me other than make me have an existential crisis about my own waste stream? Well, I am presently living in a dorm at the Marine Lab at Bowdoin College in Maine, very temporarily, while my spouse has another job in another state. So that's partially because I'm an academic and it's hard to get a full-time job, and it's partially because the pandemic has forced us to take positions where we can get them. I also spent a lot of time in front of my computer, in front of this camera, talking to students. I taught the last 2.5 semesters before the fall term online. We went online in spring break. We never went back. The following year, I was at a new institution in a new state I'd never been to before, teaching online to kids I never would meet. And then the next term after the winter break, I came and did it again. And honestly, I learned a lot. It was a really good experience, but it was really hard. It's hard to connect with students and to have those mentor relationships with folks when you don't actually get to see them and talk to them, get a sense for how they're really feeling. So it was a big struggle in terms of teaching, and in terms of research. I mean, it's been impossible to be honest. My research, my coral research, especially my international field research, has been entirely on hold. I haven't even considered going anywhere. Just on the off chance that I would bring COVID to a place like that, where, they're not testing. I'm getting tested once a week, and there's hospitals in Maine and that are not full. And in Belize, they don't have a huge case count. But what if I, got on a plane, had COVID, and everybody got it? I would never forgive myself, right? I care too deeply about. I guess I have empathy, and I just never do that to somebody, right? So it never has even been a thing that I could do. It's been off the table until it's back on. So that shifted my research focus from how can I get to the field and do research with my colleagues to, well, there's a lot of good data out there in the world. What if I scrape some of it together and analyze it in a new and interesting way and try to still, make something meaningful out of my time? And that's what I've been doing instead. I've got a new paper coming out in the next couple of weeks that's all about taking data from all sorts of other studies about corals and how they respond to stressors, particularly disturbances like a storm or a bleaching event, and trying to figure out geographically, are there places that are more resilient or not? And does that have anything to do with the level of human influence in a place or not? You know, I'm happy to talk about it more, but it's kind of an aside. That's what I've been doing instead, is I've been doing a lot of what we call meta-analytical work. So sitting in front of a computer and writing code. And I've learned a lot, which has been great, but it has been hard. I miss the field. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only imagine how it must be like. I certainly have not had your experience, and so I can definitely understand how it's been difficult. But you're doing amazing work, and I admire your insight. And that brings us to our final question, which is, do you have any advice for citizen scientists around the country, around the world, who want to become more active in environmental conservation and combat climate change? How can the everyday person make a small impact?
Yeah, I think that just being conscious, being aware, and trying to spread that information to others is a really great way to do it. This grassroots kind of movement to sort of get the word out and get people involved is so important. I guess my two pieces of advice are, like, a long time ago when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, a mentor of mine told me that I should do what I wanted to do, as long as what I liked doing, as long as people are willing to pay me to do it. And I think that's really key. You should like what you do, and if you don't, you should think long and hard about what you really want. And my second piece of advice, more specifically about how anybody who wants to get involved can get involved, is it never hurts to ask people, right? Build that network, ask people stuff, send an email, call somebody on the phone, ask to help, just get involved. And if you don't like what you're doing, maybe you can find a new way to get involved, right? Like, several moons ago, hasn't been that long, I was working for a climate organization, like a climate lobbying organization. And I first started, and they're like, can you call new members and talk to them about what we do? And I was like, man, the number one thing I hate the most is calling people on the phone. So I don't want to do this. And I wasn't engaged in the organization for like 8 months. And then I went to a meeting in person, and they said, could you talk to people in person about like climate change? You seem like you probably know something about that. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. It was super fun. And like, can you train other people to talk about climate change? And I was like, yeah, totally. Right. So like, make sure that when you do get involved, your own particular set of skills are being used. Otherwise, like, why? Everybody has a different set of skills. I think that most organizations are starting to realize that. So don't be afraid to be like, hey, I'm really good at X. Can I do more of that? Because that'll just make you feel better, and you'll feel like you're doing more, and you'll be better at it too. So yeah, don't be afraid to network, and then also don't be afraid to like bring yourself to the thing. You don't have to fit into anybody's box. Just be you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It was great speaking with you, and I hope everyone enjoyed. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming, Dr. Baumann.
Yeah, thanks for having me.